My name is Sari van Pooije. I'm the Director of Team Agility and of Intact Academy. In Team Agility, we help businesses innovate more quickly than their products. We create agile teams and companies so that they can deal with crisis. In Intact Academy, we train up coaches and consultants to help them do that. We've been working for 35 years all over the world to establish that, and we're still going strong. What I'm talking about at the moment is how to deal with organizations in crisis and how to create directive leadership. We talked about what's necessary for directive leadership, how to reestablish boundaries, and what cohesion is and how necessary it is. In this video blog, I want to talk about how to create cohesion, because sometimes it's kind of mysterious. How do you create the need within the members in the leadership to preserve the existence of the group? I was saying how necessary cohesion is, and you can take the analogy of a marriage. So when a couple breaches the boundaries, for instance, one of the people has an affair, the boundaries of a marriage are breached. If people don't talk to each other anymore and the boundaries are breached, that's really difficult. But if they still have the idea of the marriage, that they still have the feeling of belonging, they still can remember what it was like to be in love and connected and in the boundaries of the marriage, then there's hope. And the analogy is very similar within teams. Within teams, we can still recreate cohesion, even if the structure and the relationship isn't there. If the idea of being a group is there, we can reestablish it. And there's still hope. So how do you reestablish that? How do you reestablish this feeling of cohesion in a group? Actually, during crisis, it's much easier to reestablish cohesion than under normal circumstances. During crisis, people usually feel utterly human and vulnerable, and they realize that it's not possible to survive alone. So it's much, much easier to reestablish cohesion if you do it right. So if you create directive leadership, if you create that crisis team, if you reestablish boundaries, then creating cohesion in crisis is not a difficult thing to do, usually. So we have several ways to do it. And actually, these strategies of creating cohesion are very old. They come from the 50s. And the reason most of them were created in the 50s is, of course, we were in a post-war period. Society had fallen apart. And social researchers and psychologists were thinking, how can we build up society again? How can we create a cohesive society in which we were so disrupted and so split, and countries were so different in terms of what they wanted and what part they played in the war. So in the 50s, lots of researchers started thinking about how to create cohesion. We're talking about Teifel and Festinger and Sheriff, and you can find all this in social psychology. But what we know is there are at least three major ways to create cohesiveness. And one of them comes from Festinger, who established a theory of group cohesiveness in the 1950s. He says that cohesiveness is a measure of interpersonal attraction and interdependent goals. So his way of creating cohesiveness is by creating a very attractive in-group and creating shared goals. So if you in a team can say, and we see a lot of that around, like we're the best, we're better than other people, or it's really nice to belong to us, employer of the year rewards make a group very attractive, winning makes a group very attractive, having nice people, being taken care of makes a group very attractive. But then also establishing shared goals. Shared goals are interdependent goals. What he means is if I create a goal within a group where I win if you win, I lose if you lose, I don't get my bonus unless you've gotten your goals. That's establishing interdependent goals. So I was once in a group where I had to help people find a new career. It was a big bank and there was a wave of unemployment in that bank. So people were getting fired left, right, and center. And I had to create and give a career counseling group. And the goal of that group was actually that everyone would find work. And what I thought is, okay, these people are here as a group, but I have to establish cohesiveness. How do I establish cohesiveness? By establishing a shared goal. So at the beginning of the group, I told everyone in the group, listen, this group will only be disbanded after everyone in this group has found a job. So everyone said yes because they didn't understand the consequence of their decision yet. But as time went on, of course, the best people found a job most quickly. And then they still had to stay in the group. And they were going, no, no, I've reached my goal, which is very groupy. It's not teamy that I found my job, I want to leave. And I said, no, no, you've signed a paper and it's legally binding. You have to stay in the group until everyone has found a job. And of course, after a while, those people got so tired of being in the group, they wanted to get on with their life and start a new job. They started finding jobs for the people who were left in the group. And by the end of the time, everyone had found a job. So I'm giving you this as an example of how to establish interdependent goals to create more cohesion in a group. When people come only to be with the leader and only to reach their own goals, you do not create cohesion. To create cohesion, you have to make the group attractive. So it has to have a function for someone in their life, and there have to be shared goals where people are interdependent. So that's one of the strategies of creating cohesion. Another way of establishing cohesion is to create social identity. This is more based on Teifel and Turner. And it's a bit controversial, I think, because what you do in this strategy to create cohesion is you create a process of what we call social comparison. So I don't really like this way of creating cohesion, but you see it a lot in American companies, especially. I was raised in American schools, so I went to international schools. I'm an expat kid, so we moved country every 3 years, and I always went to international schools, which were really American. And within American schools, you really learn how to compete. Almost everything is a competition. So you get points not only for academics, but also for sports, for music, and even for your social interaction. So I remember getting report cards on which I got a score for how much I was helping other people in the class. And it was competitive. So very interesting how different countries regulate that. In any case, this Teifel and Turner idea of social comparison as a way of establishing cohesion, I see it much more in more competitive, individualistic countries than I do in we countries. So that you've got I countries and we countries, speaking of Hoffman, who talks about culture. But the strategy to create cohesion through social comparison is you create an in-group and an out-group. And basically what you do is you make the in-group much more attractive than the out-group. In TA terms, we'd say you create a minus plus position. So I'm okay and you're a bit less okay than I am. And the idea is that if people feel like they're in a more okay group, they will feel more social cohesion. But the social cohesion in that case is reactive. So it's more vulnerable, I think, than the first strategy. It's reactive because it depends on you thinking that the other people outside of the group are less than you are. It's a risk. And you see companies and teams do it. When people say we're going to win, or when people say other people are worse than we are the best, or we're number one, or you often see tastes of this social comparison strategy to create cohesion. If people see themselves as a member of the group and they see themselves as ideal, and they compare themselves with the external world, and the external world is worse, the idea theoretically is that you create more social cohesion within the group. As I said, it's possible. Huh? One of the ways people do it is also to say everyone out there is an enemy and we have to win. If people think that way, you also get social cohesion, but it's temporary and it's based on fear. So you have to be a bit careful with that, especially in times of crisis when the whole world is in crisis. You really can't afford to do that, because if anything we've learned in this crisis, that there is no individual responsibility. Everything has a social consequence. So you can hear that I have an opinion about it, and that's okay. You can decide for yourself. So the third way of increasing cohesion is through a method we call social exchange. And social exchange was really something that was thought of by a guy called Thibault. And they had a really interesting way of thinking about how to create cohesion, I think. It's a bit more subtle than the second strategy, still a bit more risky, but less risky than the second strategy based on social comparison. So what they said is that to create social cohesion, it has to be more rewarding to be part of the group than it is not to be part of a group. That sounds really logical, doesn't it? So the rewards of membership have to be higher than the costs of membership. That makes sense, doesn't it? So if you have the feeling that you're getting more out of being a member of an organization than the cost, for instance, in terms of losing time, losing contact with family, travel time, boredom with your work or routine work, if the rewards are larger, for instance, in terms of being a member, status, getting a salary, having rewarding results, then you will stay as a member of that group and you will feel cohesive. So far, so good. What was interesting about Thibault is that he said it's not only this link between higher rewards and lower costs. This relationship is mediated by three other factors. And he said this equation works like higher rewards, lower costs, if people feel there are no alternatives, their investment is high, and their expectations are low. Now, this is a really interesting thinking about social cohesion, I think. So for a long time, I worked on a helpline for women who were being abused. And I always thought to myself, one evening we're saving them between brackets, and the next day they go back to that relationship. How is that possible? I was young then. So I was very young, so I didn't have that subtlety of thinking that Thibault is proposing. But Thibault actually gives an explanation of sorts for this. So in an abusive relationship, the cost of the relationship is higher than the reward, obviously. So it shouldn't be able to work. Logically, you'd think that people would leave. But the fact of the matter is there are three mediating factors. So most people in an abusive relationship think there are no alternatives. If you speak to anyone who's in an abusive relationship, they say, I don't think anybody else would love me, or I didn't think there was anywhere else I could go. And so they stay. The second mediating factor is investment. A lot of people in abusive relationships say, I've got such a history. I know them so well. I've got kids. My investment is high to stay in the relationship. And so they stay. And the third mediating factor is expectations. We know often people in abusive relationship come from abusive families, and so their expectation of relationships are very, very low, and so they stay. And so it's interesting that such a formula of creating cohesion that Thibault proposes, obviously, it can explain a lot of why people stay in this case, abusive relationship, but we could also say in organizations and teams, even though on the surface you would think, why are they working there? You know? So the third strategy of creating cohesion is to use this social exchange formula to create cohesion. Practically, it means that you increase the reward of membership, you lower the cost, yeah, and you make sure that people that there are few options which are as good out there in the labor market. You make sure that people invest. So this is interesting. It means that the harder people work, the more they're invested, the more they will stay. It's a very interesting consequence of this formula. And also you make sure that the expectations that they have, that you meet in the team, are higher than what they actually expect. So if you exceed the expectations of your employees, they will actually stay longer. So we've talked about the importance of creating cohesion during times of crisis. And we've talked now about 3 strategies to do so. The first strategy is really to create to create really good investment and attractiveness and really interdependent goals. The second strategy is to create an in and an out group where the in group is a little bit better than the out group so that people will choose to stay. And the third strategy is based on the exchange theory, where we create higher rewards, lower costs with the 3 mediating factors in between.